One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode.
So if you've known me for a while, or you've been hanging out with me here on this podcast, then you know if I don't know the answer to something, I'm going to ask someone. And today I wanted to talk about all the legal questions that I get asked on a pretty regular basis. Some of them I had myself when I first started, and I was lucky enough to have an attorney reach out to me that said, hey, if you ever have any questions about entrepreneurship, I was like, okay, hang on, hold up. Because I have a ton of questions about podcasting that I've had and that other people have had when it comes to, do I need an LLC? Do I need to trademark the name of my podcast? Do I need to have royalty-free music? And can we talk about royalty-free music? Can we talk about copyright stuff? We talked about so many things in this episode, so get ready to have a lot of your questions answered and to have some that you didn't even know about, because I learned so much in this episode. So let's just get right to it.
Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Krystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been thinking about creating a podcast for a while, well, I'm so glad you found this show. Think of this as the shortcut / time-saving version of searching Google and YouTube for hours and hours trying to figure out the world of podcasting. Trust me, as a busy mama of 3, I get it. You don't have a lot of time to be spent, or wasted, I should say, searching the web, trying to find all the right ideas and all the amazing things that are out there, and you just end up overwhelmed. Trust me, I've been there, done that, took home the souvenir. But this podcast is going to help you in practical ways, because twice a week we'll be delivering episodes that are going to give you steps to help you create a podcast your audience can't wait to listen to. So let's get right to it, shall we? Have you been wanting to start a podcast? You've been thinking about it. It feels right. You just know this is the next thing that my business needs. Well, I encourage you to sign up for my 5-day podcast bootcamp. This is a thing that you have been looking for. It is a 5-day video series where I walk you through exactly how to start, launch, and market your podcast. And I throw in some more information about planning strategies and being consistent and how you can make the most out of your podcast from day one. So sign up for our 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp at krystalprofit.com/podcast bootcamp. And do it already. You know that you've been wanting to, so just bite the bullet and join us.
So as we're talking about all things podcasting on this podcast, I wanted to take a second and tell you about my digital course, Profit Podcasting, because the doors are opening at the end of August for just a short period of time. So if you've listened to a few podcast episodes or you've enjoyed any of the content I put out on social media or on YouTube, then you are going to love this digital course. I walk you through everything you need to know in order to start, launch, and market your podcast in just 30 days. So if you want to be the first to know when doors open again on August 30th, go to krystalprofit.com/podcast course to join the waitlist. But let's get back into the legal stuff, because I was so excited when Scott, today's guest, sent me an email and said, hey, I like what you're doing. I'm an attorney. And he just sent me a short email about his qualifications and the things that he does. And I jumped at the opportunity to speak to him because I had so many questions about the legal things when I first started my podcast. I wasn't sure if I needed to have my name trademarked. Did I need to be an LLC before I started making money? And then, I wanted to make sure that I'm never stepping on anybody's toes when it comes to using someone else's work, like when it's music, or what if a graphic designer creates something for me. Some of the questions are pretty general, but we get into a lot of the specifics of, kind of if you should go, talk to an attorney, of course, anytime you feel the need, you want to get further legal advice on your specific situation. But Scott and I take this interview is about really the general, broad topics, but we kind of put a specific spin on it. I hope that makes sense. So we're getting down into the nitty gritty, but we're also keeping it broad enough to where this can be applied to your podcast or your friend's podcast or anybody's podcast. So let me tell you a little bit about Scott. Scott Brookens is an attorney and an entrepreneur that loves working with new entrepreneurs and helping get their businesses started out the right way. With his legal expertise and experience as an entrepreneur running his own food processing business, Scott has a unique perspective on starting businesses. He loves to share this perspective with others and hope that they might benefit from it and find it helpful and encouraging. So let's just get started. Let's get right into my interview with Scott Brookens.
Okay, Profit Podcast. I'm so excited to introduce to you today Scott from scottbrookens.com. So welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me, Krystal. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so it was really cool. Scott actually, he shot me an email and said, hey, I have some ideas I'd like to run by you. And he's kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to entrepreneurism. So Scott, can you just share a little bit about your own entrepreneur journey and what you've been up to?
Yeah. So I have an interesting background, I guess is the best way to describe it. So I am an attorney, and I do practice law. I started my practice out actually as a corporate and securities law attorney, and did a variety of different types of legal transactions kind of under that banner. So anything from securities offerings to mergers and acquisitions. But I also worked with entrepreneurs a lot as well that were just getting their businesses started. And that honestly was my favorite thing to do. Just love kind of the passion that people have that are just getting started with a business, and love guiding people through that process. So I love doing that, and do still continue to do that. But a couple of years ago, I actually left practicing law full time and purchased a food processing business. And so that's actually where I'm spending most of my time, just running that day to day. I've got over 35 employees, and we produce a lot of food. So it's something that has been just an awesome, an unexpected tangent to my journey, but I think gives me a really interesting perspective as well. Now, not just being an attorney that's advising clients through that process, but also being an entrepreneur that has kind of lived that process as well. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I love that, like you said, you have this whole perspective and not just being, an attorney-client relationship. Like, you understand the questions that come up as someone that's going through an entrepreneurial journey. I'm sure everything has shifted from, whenever you very first started working with clients, but you said something really important I want to touch on. And you were talking about, you used to do mergers and acquisitions. And before we hit record on this episode, we were talking about the different aspects of law. So can you kind of touch on some of the things that you were telling me that not everyone knows about, working with an attorney? Yeah.
So, it's interesting when you go to an attorney, or at least when an individual, it really doesn't matter what their legal needs are. It's really important that you find the right attorney that has the right type of expertise that you're looking for. And really, I think the best way, kind of the best parallel, the way to describe this is practicing law is similar to practicing medicine. And while there are general practitioners in medicine, there are also specialists that spend a lot of time getting to know a very particular part of the medical practice. And law is the same way, but it isn't as widely known for some reason, I think, in the legal profession as it is in the medical profession. Just like you wouldn't go to your general practitioner if you have a heart issue, you'll go see a specialist that understands the heart. It's not always a good idea to go to an attorney that specializes in one area if you're in need of legal services in another. So if you have a family law matter, then you shouldn't go and see somebody that specializes in business law. Just so that you can get the exact type of expertise that you need. And as an entrepreneur, when you're looking for an attorney to represent you in a particular matter or a particular issue, it's really important that you seek somebody out that has experience dealing with the particular type of legal issue that you're looking for, or can provide you customized advice for the thing that you need at that given time.
Okay. Well, that's so good to know. And I actually, I have a few specific questions about legalities when it comes to podcasting, because I hear a lot of the same questions over and over again. And I am not a lawyer. I did not go to law school. I took business law and then international business law in college. And that was a long time ago. So I'm definitely not qualified to give anybody advice. But I do see the same questions pop up over and over again. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you some of these.
Let's do it.
Okay. So the one that I see most often, and the people that are listening to this right now, they have either started a podcast or they're thinking about it, but they don't necessarily have everything up and running, and they're not getting millions of downloads, and they have this huge successful company. That's not most of our listeners. If that is you, please email me, because I want to know, I want to get an inside scoop on exactly what you're doing. But the question I get is, do I need an LLC for my podcast? Because maybe they're just starting out, and they know that in the long run, they're going to be profitable with their podcast. And they know that they want to use this as part of their business strategy, but they don't know if they need to set up an LLC first. So I guess, can you talk about exactly what an LLC is in the first place, and if we need that before or after we monetize?
Sure. Yeah, this is an awesome question. And it's one, honestly, that anybody that's kind of thinking of going down the entrepreneurial path should really sit down and consider. And so to start, I'll kind of explain what an LLC actually is. So an LLC is a type of legal entity, and what it stands for is limited liability company. That's where the LLC comes from. And what it provides is exactly in its name, which is limited liability. And limited liability is this legal concept that basically means separation, fundamentally. And what we're going to do when setting that up is we're going to limit the owner's liability, the owner of that LLC. We're going to limit their personal liability with regard to the activities of the business. And so if you're operating a business and you have whether it's a corporation or LLC, you have limited liability as an owner, meaning the individuals that are interacting with your business theoretically cannot go after you personally for the debts or the losses that they sustain when interacting with your business. And so it's this wonderful concept that allows us to protect ourselves as entrepreneurs and ensure that we can still maintain and protect our personal wealth and keep that separation from our business. And so that's fundamentally what a limited liability company is. And a corporation offers limited liability as well. But you don't need to necessarily form an LLC or a corporation in order to operate a business. By default, if you don't do anything and you just start operating a business, you are called you're what's called a sole proprietor. And a sole proprietor just basically means a single business owner, and that's what it means. But the downside to doing that is you don't have this limited liability protection that comes with operating under an entity like an LLC or a corporation. The upside to operating as a sole proprietor is that you have unlimited flexibility. You really don't have to do anything. You just, if you're operating a business, that's just what you are. But you don't get that liability shield that comes when you're operating as an LLC or a corporation. And so the reality is the best way for me to answer this question is to kind of take a step back and kind of look at it in a more holistic fashion. So anybody that goes and starts a business and kind of starts their own entrepreneurial journey, really what they're going to be doing pretty much every single day in which they're engaged in operating that business is they're going to be making a lot of different risk assessments. And whether you even know it or not, you are taking risks in your business just by operating your business. And one risk that you take is kind of at the outset related to forming an entity is am I going to do this? Am I going to operate under an LLC or am I going to stay as the sole proprietor? And sometimes individuals decide that they're going to take a little bit more of a bigger risk and they're going to continue to operate as a sole proprietor because there's more flexibility with it. They don't have to do anything to actually start the business. They can just go. Or maybe they can't afford to form an LLC. And so they basically in that situation are making a risk assessment that they're willing to take on that additional risk that comes with not having the liability protection. And others that maybe are more risk averse and want to protect themselves decide to form an LLC or a corporation and operate their business that way so they get that liability shield. And really, that is a decision that every entrepreneur has to make at some point in time as to whether or not they're willing to take the risk and operate their business without that liability protection, or whether they're going to, hold off on operating the business and form an LLC or a corporation and begin to operate with that liability shield.
Okay.
The best practice here and what I'm typically recommending people do that are operating businesses is to just form an LLC and move on. It's typically pretty simple to form. It's not always that expensive. And it is a pretty flexible type of entity and fits probably 90% of the individuals that are operating businesses out there in the small business context. And so that's usually what I'm recommending when people come and talk to me is let's just get you an LLC formed and you can start rocking and rolling in your business.
Well, what if I'm just sitting here thinking of an example of a student that I was helping and, she had a plan of, I'm just going to kind of do this as my hobby. This is going to be my hobby. And if it takes off, it takes off. So what would you recommend for someone who is just kind of, playing around? Like they're like, I think I want to do a podcast, but I don't know I'm not ready to go all in just yet. So are there any kind of signs? Like, I guess, would it be, okay, I'm about to start monetizing, or are you legal as just a content creator? If you're just putting stuff out there, this is just your hobby. Does that change? I don't know if that was a 2-part question or if that was all one question, but do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah. And so I think the best way to answer that question is to kind of go back to that framework from a risk-based analysis. And so that individual, if you're just kind of operating and this is a hobby for you and you're not really monetizing it, what you have to kind of look through and think about is, am I doing anything that could potentially expose me to some sort of liability?
Gotcha.
Am I providing some sort of advice to individuals that they might act on? And if they don't do it correctly, could they somehow get hurt or get in trouble or something like that? And then come back to me and say, why did you do that? You should compensate me because you didn't provide me with good advice. that's one way to look at it. But the reality is whenever we open up and start to speak about different things, particularly on the internet and with the world being as big as it is, there is some risk that's associated with that. Now, in that situation, what individuals really need to do is make that determination of, even if this is a hobby, is it worth it to me to potentially be exposed to some type of liability? And do I see any type of liability? And if I don't, then it's probably okay to just operate without an entity. But once you start to monetize and once you start to grow your audience base, and if you're providing some sort of specialized advice, it's probably a pretty good idea to start thinking about, what does it look like for me to form an entity and do this in a more cohesive, structured way. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. I just thought of like 15 different like genres of podcasting where, obviously like an entertainment one, if you're just sitting around talking about, who died on Game of Thrones or, like stuff like that, that's not actually affecting someone's life, in any kind of way, you're probably okay if it's for entertainment purposes. But if you're giving tactical advice, let's say to lose weight or something in health and fitness, then you might want to, consider it. And I think that you answered that question so well. And there's a lot of our listeners who will definitely consider, like, just zoom out a little bit. Let's look at the big picture and look at the long-term goal of, where do you want to be in a year with your podcast? And I think that, for me personally, an LLC is definitely a way to go. I mean, it's for me, it's a better safe than sorry. That's what I think of.
And that's typically what I recommend, because so in Michigan, like, I could have an LLC form for $50 and it'd be back to me by tomorrow, because our state is pretty quick at processing the forms. And I really, I know how to do these things, but, not every state is like that. And, other states have different rules and different tax laws that kind of impact the decision to form an entity. But my perspective, typically, whenever I'm sitting down and talking to people, is just take the safe route, form the LLC. You've got it there. And if you never do anything with it, that's okay. But at least it's there. And at least you've kind of taken that step and you've checked that limited liability box off, provided you're operating it correctly and taking advantage of all the features of it. So typically, I'm just recommending that individuals take the step to form the LLC because it's pretty simple and cheap to do so. But it's something that everybody just has to sit down and make that determination for themselves. But even like in the scenario that you just described, where there's an individual that's sitting and talking about entertainment, like what happened on Game of Thrones. In that situation, maybe they've got a website and they're posting different things and they're pulling stock photos from different websites, or pulling photos online. In that situation, they could potentially be exposing themselves to liability as well from copyright infringement or whatever it might be. And so just because you're operating as a hobby doesn't necessarily mean that there's no risk to you. And that's the sort of assessment that you have to make personally and determine, like, is this worth the risk to me, or should I be operating this as a business? And it certainly starts to make a lot more sense when the money starts to roll in. And if you're not really making a whole lot of money, then there definitely is, potential tax issues there as well. So you have to have a conversation about it internally and decide what's the right step for me in this. And typically, I'm recommending that individuals take the step and just form the LLC so the protection is there.
Well, I'm so glad that you just mentioned that about stock photos and images and using other people's stuff online, because actually my next question is, what should everyone do? Because I get asked all the time about music, like, oh, I want to use this music. I just know that this one, whatever song it is, would work perfectly with my podcast. But then they say, but how do I use it? And I just I don't even give any advice, because I'm like, I'm deer in headlights. And my approach to music with a podcast is always hire someone to produce something custom, because then you're not infringing on anybody's copyrights anywhere. But I know that that's not an option for everybody. So what is your take on royalty-free music? And what do we need to know about copyright infringement and everything with that?
So that's a super broad question. I'm really glad you brought it up, because honestly, it is an issue that so many people face, and people face it and have absolutely no idea that they're so innocent about it because they just don't know what the rules are.
Right.
I had a really good friend of mine who has a podcast, And he got hit a couple months ago by Getty Images because he was using one of their photos on his website, and he had absolutely no idea that it was a Getty photo. He pulled it off of Google, put it on his website, and they sent him a cease and desist and demanded that they pay him a license fee of, I think, $1,000.
Wow.
And obviously take the photo down. So, and he had no idea. And honestly, he had zero recourse because he was infringing on their copyright. And those sorts of things can happen so innocently. So it could be stock photos, it could be stock music, it could be sounds, it could be templates that people are using and without really understanding it. So there's a lot of issues that come when we start to put content out online, and you have to be really careful about how you're doing that to start. I mean, I would say that's the number one thing, is just be very conscious of what type of content you're putting up on your website, and that you know that you have the right to use it, because it does happen. People will come after you for infringing on their copyrights if you're not careful, and it happens all the time, honestly. So number one is just be careful about what you're doing and be very conscious of it. Don't be flippant about using content that you find through Google searches. So another thing is, you talked about copyright music and actually hiring somebody to create music for you. The interesting thing about actually going that route, and I think this is important for people to understand, the way that the law works when it comes to copyrighted work is the author of the work is actually the one that gets the copyright in a particular work. So if you go out and you just say, hey, Joe, will you write a song for me? And so that I can put it on my podcast, and he writes a song for you and lets you use it on his podcast. The reality is, you don't own that. Even if you pay him for it, you don't own that song. Joe actually does. And Joe's just giving you a license to use it on your site or on your podcast, unless you have a legal document or contract that stipulates that Joe is making that song for you as a work made for hire. You don't have ownership in it. You have to have that term of art, work made for hire, in order to obtain the ownership for it. And so it's a complicated area. Copyright and intellectual property law in general is a complicated area of the law that you have to be careful when you're navigating it. So even if you try and go out there and hire somebody to do something for you or create something for you, like a graphic designer or somebody working on like a photographer to get photos for you, you would think, and typically what most people assume is that because I'm paying somebody to do something for me, that I own that property. And that's not always the case. And so that's another thing, is just be cognizant of how the law actually works and what your risks are in those particular contexts. Now, when it comes to copyright music, and specifically royalty-free music, what you need to understand and what you really need to be paying attention to is what the license agreement actually says. So if I go to a website and I see that there's royalty-free music available for it, and I find a song that I really like and that I want to use, you need to make sure that you understand, what does the license agreement say for my use of this particular piece of music? And royalty-free is kind of a generalized term. It doesn't necessarily have any legal significance. The author or the owner of the work itself gets to kind of stipulate what the restrictions of that license are. And so you want to read the license and just understand and make sure you have a good understanding of what the restrictions are. Typically, when you buy something that's royalty-free, it provides you with the ability to kind of use that piece of work without having to come back and pay the owner of that work. And so it's a really good tool, and it can be an awesome thing for individuals that are just starting out, whether it's a podcast or website or whatever it is that you're doing. But you just want to make sure you understand what is the terms of the license, and what are those restrictions that might be in there for how I can use this before you actually start using it.
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
Oh Oh my gosh. Like everything that you just said makes so much sense. And it just like, all I kept thinking the whole time you were talking was read the fine print, always read the fine print. Because what I suggest to a lot of my clients, a lot of my students is, they have these freelance sites now. You have upwork.com, you have fiverr.com, and you have these people. But, I know that within my agreement, and this is just because I'm so detail oriented and I'm so scared to get sued. Like I'm just
Awesome.
terrified that someone's going to show up, with like a cease and desist, like on my doorstep. And that just scares me. So, but I think about, the actual wording that, in the agreement, I messaged this person back and forth a few times and I was like, okay, just so we're clear, after this transaction is complete, like what is going to happen? And he was like, yes, like I'm creating this, you have the rights to this music. I made sure that I had something in writing, quote unquote, it was on the internet, but it was a message that said, you own this. And I mean, that just blew my mind though, about you saying, because there are so many stock sites out there for royalty-free music. And this is something that I get asked all the time. And I've never used one because I'm so scared. I'm so terrified of getting sued.
Well, and that's it. And that's the thing is, it typically in those situations, those sites are they want people to come and pay for a license and be able to utilize that in a lot of different contexts. And so, I used to actually work at a film production company, and we would use royalty-free music in different applications a fair amount, and we never ran into any issues with it. And typically the sites that we're using were pretty reputable, and they didn't want to build a reputation for going after people that were utilizing their music as long as they were paying for it.
Right.
But a lot of times those licenses said, hey, this is royalty free, which means you can use it for the particular purpose that you're purchasing it for, but that doesn't just mean you can use it in any work that you want moving forward. And some actually did have that expansive of a license where it's like, hey, yeah, you pay $100 for this particular song, and you can use it for anything you want as long as you're never reselling the song. Right. So it depends. Like every site is a little different. So your initial gut instinct to read the fine print is exactly right, because it's not always consistent from site to site. But they can be really good tools for individuals to use in order to get access to copyrighted work that typically would be very expensive for them to obtain on their own.
Okay. Well, that's so good. I'm glad, because that's a question that I just get so often. So I'm glad that you cleared that up. Always read the fine print. That's the moral of the story, guys. Like always read the fine print.
Definitely.
But we touched on this earlier a little bit about, some of our listeners have podcasts that relate to, being a nutrition expert or a fitness expert or a life coach or a money expert. Like, I mean, it just kind of runs the gamut across what everyone talks about. So someone had asked me before, do I need to have a disclaimer on every single episode that I produce, saying something like this is meant for informational purposes only? Or do they need to have something like seek legal advice or seek medical advice? Like what kind of disclaimer should someone include? And does it need to be on every single episode?
So this goes right back to that framework that we talked about kind of at the beginning of the conversation, when we're talking about risk-based assessments and just kind of assessing our own personal, as entrepreneurs, our own personal risk tolerance. So individuals that are a little bit more risk tolerant may not see the need to move forward with some sort of a disclaimer like that. And individuals that are a bit more risk averse probably feel like this is something that I really should be doing. So here's the reality. When it comes to operating our business, what we want to do, and what as an attorney I'm typically advising clients to do, is we're looking for the potential risks that are out there that exist as they operate their business, and we're trying to mitigate those risks as much as we can. So one way that we mitigate risk is by forming legal entities, so that we're providing those owners with that protection of limited liability. Another way that we try to mitigate risk is through insurance and having insurance coverage that's appropriate for the business. Another way that we can mitigate risk as attorneys and working with our clients is through contracts and just trying to stipulate terms for a particular relationship so that everybody's on the same page, and understanding what recourse is available if somebody breaches a particular agreement and doesn't deliver what they say they're going to deliver. And so That's kind of what we're looking at. We're looking at all these different situations and all these different risks, and we're trying to work towards mitigating those risks as much as we can. And a disclaimer is one of the ways that an individual can try to mitigate some of the risk that they might be exposing themselves to by operating their business. And sometimes disclaimers are actually in written form or contract form, whether it's in a terms of service on a website, or in an actual written agreement between two parties, or in the case of a podcast, it's not uncommon to see disclaimers actually, in audio form in a particular episode. And so the reality is when it comes to disclaimers, they don't necessarily have a whole lot of legal significance in that. And what I mean when I say that is, it's not like, oh, I put this disclaimer here, and so I'm completely covered.
Right.
I've got a full defense towards anybody that would bring an action against me because they suffered a loss based on something that I said on this podcast episode. That's not exactly how disclaimers work. More, what I would say, at least as it relates to disclaimers, is the number one reason why you want to do this is because you want to provide a very practical and honestly a helpful reminder to the individuals that are listening to your podcast or whatever it is, however they're engaging with your business. You want to provide them with just a practical reminder that, hey, this is generalized advice. It may not be right for you based on your specific circumstances. And so it's a good idea for you to go out and maybe talk to somebody that can sit down, hear your specific situation, and provide you with customized advice to help you through it. So that's really what we're doing when we do a disclaimer, is we just want to be helpful, and we want to remind people that not everything is exactly right for them, or not everything that we're saying is perfectly attuned to their situation. And the other reason why disclaimers can be helpful is if there is some sort of loss that an individual sustains and you get sued because of it, having a disclaimer is helpful in a legal action to basically, as a defense, to basically say, hey, I warned them. I told them that
Right.
you should probably go out and seek some legal advice. But the reality is while it is a defense that you can point to if you do get sued, it's not going to be a complete bar to being sued. So to answer your question as to whether or not an individual, should be putting something like that on there, again, it comes back down to a risk-based assessment. And for individuals that are a little bit more risk averse, that want to protect themselves, it's certainly not a bad idea to do it, as long as they understand that it's not going to be a complete bar or a full defense if they were to get sued by somebody that was listening to their podcast. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Yeah, 100%. I think that, like you said, I think it's a good thing to have, but I like that you said it's definitely not a blanket for like, oh, you put a disclaimer, you don't have any problem. Like, don't worry about, nobody's going to come after you. Like that, it's really eye-opening, because I don't share necessarily a lot of things that would put someone at risk, or, hopefully no one would suffer a loss from the information that I provide. But I do know that there are people out there. I have one client who has a home birth podcast. Mm-hmm. And so I could totally see some of the information that she shares. She have to be very careful with what she says or how she says it, because, who knows what could happen and what she could be held liable for. So that definitely helps in just, I think it goes back to better to be safe than sorry, and, seek advice from someone, whether it's an attorney or someone, that knows the industry and can give you guidance on your specific situation.
Yeah, there's so much wisdom in everything that you just said there, Krystal. There really is. And the reality is I really default to kind of the former that I just spoke about a minute ago, which is, if you have a show like a podcast and you're providing individuals with assistance and general information, I would hope that your goal is to really, really provide them with tangible value. And so the truth of the matter is not every piece of advice that you give on a podcast episode is going to be right for every single person. And so providing the disclaimer, really, at the end of the day, the best reason to do it, I believe, is because we just want to be helpful, and we just want to remind people that, hey, this is general. It may not be right for you. And so it's really a good idea for you to go and find somebody that can sit down with you and counsel you through your specific situation. And that, I think, is a really helpful and like value-oriented reason why one would want to give a disclaimer above and beyond just trying to be, protect ourselves.
Right.
Well, that's good. Oh, so good, Scott. Like these are such great questions. I'm so glad that we're getting answers to these because, like I said, I get asked them all the time. But I want to circle back around to using like stock photos and images and music and everything. Another question related to that copyright is people asking about trademarking their podcast name.
Sure.
And is this something that needs to happen? Like, is it necessary, or is it just kind of like an added, okay, I have this amazing name and I want to make sure no one else steals it. No one else gets it. So tell me all about what you think about trademarking a podcast show name.
Yeah, so that's an awesome question. Trademark law is another one of those areas of the law that can be very complicated. There's an entire kind of component of case law where there's been different legal actions and judges have kind of weighed in and given opinions in different scenarios and different issues that relate to trademark law. So it's a very dense and honestly complicated area of the law. And so it's honestly it goes back to really a lot of that. It depends. So in answering your question, it can really depend. And it can depend on so many different factors. So I'll provide some generalized ideas and concepts. But the reality is everybody that's kind of looking or thinking through trademark law really does need to sit down with a trademark attorney and talk through the specifics of their situation. Now, that being said, a couple of just generalized ideas for people to know and understand. First of all, trademark, like copyright, it's a really interesting facet of the law, because an individual actually has rights simply by creating and using a particular work. So if I go out in the example of copyright, if I go and write a book, I actually have a copyright interest in that book, even if I don't register that as a copyright and receive federal registration of that copyright. And trademark law is similar to that. There's actually something called common law or unregistered protection that comes by just having a particular mark and using that mark in commerce. And that protection actually comes from the courts. It's kind of been developed over years and years of individuals utilizing different marks in commerce, and then when they've been infringed upon, suing somebody that's infringing them, and then case law kind of develops from that. And so that's what the common law protection really, where it comes from. And basically what that means is if you have a name that you are using for your business and you've been operating your business for a while and somebody tries to start using that same name, you probably have or potentially have a claim against them for trademark infringement, and you could sue them even if your trademark is not registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So that is kind of like the basis of it, is like people should remember that, like, hey, I'm using this name and it's kind of unique to me, and I do have rights in that name even if I don't go through the process of registering that trademark with the USPTO's office. Now, registration does provide some additional protection, and there's honestly a lot of facets to the protection that come with it. But for the most part, what it is it's kind of a stamp that the United States puts on your trademark and says, hey, we recognize that this person owns this particular trademark and that they have rights to defend against anybody else trying to use that mark or any similar mark that kind of could be confusing with that particular mark. And so really, to answer your question though, and get back to the core of it as to whether or not somebody should trademark their podcast name, it comes down to a risk-based assessment of how important is that name to that individual, and do they really need additional protection above and beyond that which they get from common law trademark protection. And that really is going to depend on every person, and they're going to have to make that assessment themselves. And then the other thing to really note as it relates to trademarks is not every mark is going to be something that can be registered and receive a federal trademark. So marks that are descriptive in nature, that kind of is actually a really broad category. But if I own a bagel shop and I want to go and trademark it as Scott's Bagels, and I'm selling bagels, it could be somewhat challenging for me because that mark is pretty descriptive. So it could be challenging for me to get a trademark for that. And the trademark office is usually pretty hesitant to trademark individuals' names. So if I wanted to trademark scottbrookens.com, they would be pretty hesitant to grant me that trademark. It might be a little challenging for me to do that. The other thing that they're pretty hesitant to trademark is geographic names. So I live in West Michigan, and I see a lot of companies that are West Michigan this or West Michigan that. Those can be a little bit more challenging to trademark as well. So geographic notations of a particular business, and really anything that can be very descriptive in nature, like I mentioned in the bagel example. So that's why, like, sitting down with a trademark attorney for your specific trademark, it would be really helpful, and they can help you make that determination and that assessment as to whether or not it's worth it to move forward with a trademark for a particular podcast name.
This is such good information, because a lot of the things that you've said, I kind of like, I was thinking, okay, I think that this is how it works, but you definitely, cleared the kind of murky waters and like, I think that this is how it should be, but I'm so glad that you touched on this is how it actually is. And, I think that the bottom line is if you want, like, if you're in this and you see this as a long-term strategy, as either a whole business or an extension of your business, then I think that it's worth, talking to someone that specializes in exactly what you want to do. So Scott, I really appreciate all of your legal advice today, which is, I think going to help so many people just understand whether I need to go do this or I'm not to that point yet. I think that that's like the biggest takeaway from today, and just some things to think about as we grow and we continue to, because I know that's what you're doing. You're growing your podcast. Like, you are just going to be so successful that I want you to contact Scott and say, hey, Scott, I have some questions. So with that being said, I want to ask you a few rapid fire questions. These are just going to be some fun little questions I came up
Let's
with.
do it.
The first one is, do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
It depends on the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can be a perfectionist. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So I know that you have thought about creating your own podcast. Is that correct?
I have thought about creating my own podcast. Yes. Yeah.
So who would your dream podcast guest be?
Oh man. There's two that come to mind.
Okay.
But I'm going to say, I think Pat Flynn.
Pat Flynn.
Yeah. Pat
That's
Flynn's
awesome.
that got me kind of into the online business world in general. And I love that guy, and I consume pretty much everything that he puts out. So yeah, I think he'd probably be my dream podcast guest.
That's awesome. And most of our listeners know who Pat Flynn is, but if you don't, I mean, he's just the man when it comes to passive income. And he is actually who I am aspiring. I'm like, I'm going to be the female version of Pat Flynn. Like, that is my goal, like, for
That's
sure.
awesome.
So that is an amazing guest to have. Okay, my last question I have for you is, what's one piece of advice you would like to give to someone who is a brand new baby entrepreneur? What would you want to say to them?
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. There's a lot. So I think that entrepreneurship is, like, bar none, the most rewarding path that anybody could go down. And the journey of it is just absolutely incredible. But it is, without a doubt in my mind, the hardest journey that anybody could choose. I always call it like the ultimate endeavor. It is something that is going to test you in so many different ways. And I think there's a lot of people that get into their own type of, get into entrepreneurship or, running their own business. And their hope is that they can kind of control their schedule and gain more freedom in their life. And the reality is it's probably going to be a heck of a lot more work than just working a 9 to 5. But I think the rewards are so much greater. And so my piece of advice would be, to an individual just getting started out is, hey, like, you're going to have some challenges. I guarantee it. And it's going to be really hard on certain days. But what you have to do is just continue to push through. And I promise that there's going to be a lot of reward that comes with it.
Right. And just to, like, I'm sitting here thinking, like, just like strap in and hang on for dear life. I mean, like, that's what
right.
I'm imagining, a roller coaster. It's like you're going to have ups and you're going to have downs. And that's just, that's such a great piece of advice. But Scott, I so appreciate everything that you shared with us today. But I want to know, where can our listeners find more about you and everything that you're up to?
Yeah, awesome. So scottbrookens.com is my website, and that's the best place to connect with me. I've got a free guide there that people can check out that just walks through the basic steps that are involved in getting a business started and off the ground. And then you can follow me on LinkedIn and just search Scott Brookens, and would love to connect with individuals there as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for everything today, Scott.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Krystal. I'm honored to be here.
Wow, that was so great. Like, he helped so much clarify a lot of the questions that I still have to this day. I've been doing this for a year, and I have questions pop up all the time that I'd never even thought about, like some of the copyright things when it comes to images. I have a blog as well, and so knowing that no matter if you're doing this to financially gain something, or you're just doing it as a hobby, or you're just trying to share information, just be very careful about what you put out into the world, and knowing whether it's yours or someone else's, or if you need to have a licensing agreement in order to use it. Just be very careful with the content that you put out online. And Scott and I talked off the air, and I think that we're going to be having more conversations about podcasting and the legalities that we need to know. So please send us any questions that you may have that we didn't answer here today, because it was a great conversation, and I think that we're really on to something, and I hope that we can answer more of your questions in the future. But that does it for today's episode. So be sure to check out the show notes at krystalprofit.com/episode 75 to check out Scott's free gift that he has for you, because it's pretty amazing. And make sure that you sign up for the free 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp, and also join the waitlist for Profit Podcasting. There's going to be a webinar that's coming up at the end of the month that's going to teach you all about building an email list with a podcast. So if you're on the wait list, you'll get notified as soon as registration opens for that. And then of course you'll know when the doors open. And y'all, I have been working so hard, not only on the course, but I have some pretty cool surprises in store for those that join us. And I'm so excited about this. This is just so much fun to me. Y'all know I geek out on all things podcasting. But sorry about the sound here. I am actually still on vacation with the family. I'm looking at a sunrise as we speak in the hill country, and it is gorgeous, but I'm in a hotel lobby. So if there were some noises and everything on this episode, then that is why. There's a fireplace going. There is a small pond like inside, like, I don't know, it's beautiful here, but it's kind of loud. So I will be returning to the regular scheduled programming next week, but I'm so excited to see what's coming up in the future, and just to keep delivering you all the information that's going to help you on your podcasting journey. So remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.
Hey, Profit Podcast listeners, thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, "Send Krystal a text message." And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, "Send Krystal a text message." And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.